Since the pandemic began, there have been issues with medical supplies manufactured in China. Now, the New York Times reports that there will be a delay in shipping critical medical supplies so the country can inform quality inspections. How did our global welfare become so dependent on China and subject to the ebbs and flows of global trade wars? Author Matthew Klein's latest book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars: How Rising Inequality Distorts the Global Economy and Threatens the International Peace. He has a few answers. He's an economics commentator at Barron's, and he joins me now via Skype. Matthew, thank you so much for joining the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So as I was telling you during the break, you were recommended to me by friend of the show, Chris Arnott, who Crystal and I hold in very high esteem. Tell us a little bit about the book. Trade Wars Are Class Wars seem perfectly timed to the moment, to be honest. So tell us, what did you come away and what is relevant about your book in the light of the coronavirus crisis that we find ourselves in right now?
Sure. So a lot of people think of the trade conflict between China and the United States as being about geopolitics or incompatible national interests. But that's not really right. What we want people to understand is that trade conflicts between countries are driven fundamentally by class conflicts within them. So if you're an American worker, Chinese workers are not your enemy, just as if you're a Chinese worker, American workers aren't your enemy. Rather, American and Chinese elites, often working together, do things that hurt ordinary people in both China and the United States. So in the context of the coronavirus crisis, what we've seen is that manufacturing has been moved away from places where the labor share of income was relatively high, such as the United States, to places where workers are systematically underpaid, such as China. And that's bad for Americans, but it's also bad for Chinese, who are fundamentally they're not getting paid as much as they should, and therefore they are able to buy fewer things than they should.
Mm-hmm. So, Matthew, I think it's a really important story, which is that, as you said, it's not worker v. worker. It's actually elites, together, kind of screwing the workers of both countries. Talk to us about how that happened. I mean, how did this kind of consensus come about? And what was it that deprived American workers of the power that they had to be able to push back? Was there a conceit that was sold to them? Tell us about that process.
So it's a complex story, and it's different in different places. So we spend a lot of time focusing on three particular economies: China, Germany, and the United States. And each one is different, but in many ways, sort of the key events occur in 1989. On one hand, you have the pro-democracy movement in China, which is then brutally crushed in June of that year. And then on the other side, in Germany and Eastern Europe, you have the liberation from communism and the Soviet Union. Obviously, these are two very different events, but the consequences of both end up being that power is shifted politically and economically from working people to what we call elites. And elites can mean different things in different places. So in China, for example, if you're a senior government official in one of the provinces, or you are an executive at a state-owned enterprise, you might not appear to be rich, but you are an elite. You have access to resources. If you are conventionally sort of a rich person in Germany, you are an elite. But these people ended up gaining more and more power for themselves in a sort of complex process unique to each country, which we go through, and that ended up being that workers end up losing out. And oftentimes what happened, at least in the West, was there was a rhetoric of competitiveness. The idea that in order to sustain businesses, you had to be willing to accept pay cuts for workers, or at least workers had to be paid less than they were really adding in value. And so what you saw in Germany, for example, between the early 1990s and 2008, a massive decline in the share of business income that went to workers, and a massive increase in the amount that was going to owners and to creditors of companies. And that was paralleled in a significant slowdown, if not decline, in consumption. And the thing is, this is a self-reinforcing process. So this happens, in Germany, for example, and other companies they find they're having a much harder time, selling their goods in Germany because there's less money to go around. So they have a choice. They can either try to sell more to their domestic consumers, but there are sort of natural constraints there in terms of income and how much they're willing to borrow, or they can try to compete by cutting wages at home. But again, as we described, that's sort of a downward spiral. It's when people talk about beggar thy neighbor, that's essentially what happens. Companies everywhere are individually trying to cut their own costs, but because worker income is ultimately what provides demand for businesses, they're hurting themselves in the long run, and you have to break that spiral.
So Matthew, what do we do about it? What can each country, we all kind of seem locked into this global financial system in which we're always going to have to pursue that incentive. What can we as Americans, what can we do as a global community in order to fight back against this?
Sure. So there's sort of two basic approaches. One is that at the individual country level, we can try to either, reducing inequality domestically is definitely doable. We have the ability, the tax system and so forth, changes in sort of monopoly policy, right? It's not, we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel. We just have to actually do these things. Or in certain countries, Germany and also actually the United States, there's plenty of infrastructure that needs to be invested in and maintained. And governments just haven't been doing that because they have this sort of misplaced fear about, balanced budgets or fetish for it. And particularly in Germany, obviously things are changing a little bit right now, but it's generally true that there's been sort of a long-term period of underinvestment. Things like that can be changed. But ultimately, the real change has to occur in the places that are really hurting their workers. And Europe and China are the most predominant ones. And if that doesn't happen, then that puts countries like the United States in a very rough spot, because either we have to sort of cut ourselves off from the rest of the global economy, which would definitely make us poor, we'd be relatively, do better from that scenario than everyone else, but it would still make us poor. Or, we hope that they would do things that are ultimately in the interest of the vast majority of people. What's interesting is that if you look at, for example, the recommendations we have for China in the end of the book, this is something my co-author Michael has mentioned. He's been living in China for almost 20 years and following things closely. This is stuff that actually the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has said that they want to do for quite a long time. And you can look at their official statements, their 5-year plans. They actually are pretty consistent in many of the recommendations that we have. So what's interesting is that it hasn't happened, which I think gives you a sense of either, could be that there's a degree of insincerity there, but it's also just the nature of the system is such that, it's more decentralized than it looks, and a lot of people in a lot of places have built up a lot of interest in maintaining the status quo and prevent, even if, someone like Xi Jinping says they want something to go a certain way, it's not the top priority, then, provincial officials and heads of state enterprises and so forth can kind of get away with doing what they want. And that makes it very hard to make change.
Well, I think that's such an important point about the decentralization of the process and about how hard it is really to reverse some of what's been made here. Matt, thank you so much for joining the show. Tell everybody where they can find the book.
Anywhere books are sold, which I guess nowadays is going to be the internet. And hopefully delays will not be too bad, to make room for a critical supply.
There we go. Trade Wars Are Class Wars. Really enjoy the interview. It's a great book. Thank you so much for joining the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.